It is the morning of March 20, 1991 in New York City, and the air is crisp and clear. In a 53rd floor apartment on East 57th Street, a 4-year-old boy named Connor is running through the hallway in his pajamas laughing. He is waiting for his father to pick him up. They had spent the previous evening at the Long Island Circus watching clowns and elephants, and it was the happiest night of the child's short life. A janitor had been cleaning a large floor-to-ceiling window in the living room. The window had been left open to dry. In a split second of unimaginable catastrophic horror, the boy ran past, slipped, and fell into the open sky. 53 stories below, Eric Clapton was sitting in his room at the Mayfair Hotel, tying his shoes, getting ready to take his son to the Central Park Zoo. The phone rang. It was Connor's mother, Lori Del Santo, screaming hysterically. Eric rushed to the apartment building, but by the time he arrived, police cars and ambulances were blocking the street. For years, Eric Clapton had been known as one of the greatest guitar gods in rock history. He was the man fans called Slowhand, the man who had survived heroin addiction, alcoholism, and the chaotic fires of the 1970s. But nothing in his life could have prepared him for the brutal, shattering reality of burying his 4-year-old son in the quiet churchyard of Ripley, Surrey. The world expected Eric Clapton to destroy himself. In the past, whenever tragedy hit, he plunged into bottles of vodka and heavy drugs. But at the funeral, standing beside the small wooden casket, Eric made a silent vow. He would not take a drink. He would not run away into darkness. Instead, he packed a single suitcase, grabbed an old nylon string classical guitar, and flew to the isolated island of Antigua. He locked himself in a small cottage near the sea, sat on the porch with his guitar, and began to play. What came out of those lonely months in Antigua was not a roaring rock anthem. It was a soft, trembling acoustic lullaby, a song so intimate, so heartbreaking that Eric initially had no intention of ever releasing it to the public. He wrote it for one person only, a 4-year-old boy he would never get to hold again. This is not a song written for the charts. It is not a song written for radio. It is not even a song written for a rock star's career. It is a song about a father trying to build a bridge across the infinite void between life and death. Stay with me, because the story of how this private acoustic prayer became one of the biggest hit records in human history is a masterclass in how pain turns into art. When Eric returned from Antigua in late 1991, he was approached by film director Lily Finney Zanuck. She was directing a dark movie about addiction called Rush, starring Jason Patric and Jennifer Jason Leigh, and she asked Eric to compose the instrumental soundtrack. Eric agreed, seeing it as a way to throw himself entirely into work. While working on the score, Eric brought out a quiet fragment of a melody he had written on his nylon string guitar in Antigua. He had written the first verse and the chorus, but he couldn't bring himself to finish the rest. The words hurt too much to write alone, so he called in veteran songwriter Will Jennings, the acclaimed lyricist who would later co-write My Heart Will Go On for Titanic. Now here is the detail everyone misses. Will Jennings initially refused to finish the song. When Eric played him the opening line, "Would you know my name if I saw you in heaven?" Will felt a chill run down his spine. He looked at Eric and said, "This song is too personal, Eric. It's too deep. You have to write it yourself." But Eric looked back at him and said, "I can't. I've written the first verse, but I need you to help me build the rest of the house. I need help putting words to what I am feeling." Will Jennings sat down with Eric in the studio, and together they worked on the remaining lyrics. Will wrote the verses questioning fate and time, while Eric insisted on keeping the core chorus simple, pure, and direct. "'Cause I know I don't belong here in heaven." Listen to this. The whole emotional weight of the song hangs on one subtle chord movement. Eric played the track in the key of a major, but whenever he sings the word heaven, the music shifts into a soft descending F-sharp minor chord. In music theory, moving from a bright major key into a relative minor key creates an instant feeling of bittersweet nostalgia. It feels like stepping from sunlight into shadow. The music lifts you up for a second and then gently drops your heart back down to earth. They recorded the track at Windsor Studios with producer Russ Titelman. Eric didn't use an electric guitar or heavy amplifiers. He played a Spanish Juan Alvarez nylon string guitar, picking the strings softly with his fingers. Accompanying him was a gentle pulsing bass by Nathan E. subtle percussion by Steve Ferrone, and a haunting harmonica line played by Jay Levin. When the song was released on the Rush soundtrack album in January 1992, it began to drift quietly across radio stations around the world. But the defining moment of Tears in Heaven was yet to come. On January 16, 1992, Eric Clapton stepped onto a small stage at Bray Film Studios in Berkshire, England to record an episode of MTV Unplugged. At the time, MTV Unplugged was a popular show, but nobody expected an acoustic live album to become a cultural phenomenon. Eric sat on a wooden stool in front of a small studio audience dressed in a simple cardigan and wearing round glasses. He looked quiet, fragile, and deeply present. Midway through the set, he picked up his nylon string guitar, looked out at the audience, and began to pick those familiar opening notes. If you are moved by the stories of how music heals the human heart, take a moment to hit the subscribe button below. It helps us continue producing these deep dive documentaries, and it means the world to our team. Now let's go back to that night at Bray Studios, because what happened when the final chord faded out left the whole room in tears. The live performance of Tears in Heaven on MTV Unplugged was raw, unflinching, and completely unvarnished. Eric's voice cracked slightly on the high notes. You could see the lines of grief around his eyes. He wasn't performing for a stadium of 70,000 screaming fans. He was sitting in a room singing a lullaby to his son in heaven, while the world watched in respectful silence. When the MTV Unplugged album was released in August 1992, it exploded into a global sensation. It sold over 26 million copies worldwide, becoming the best-selling live album of all time. At the 35th Annual Grammy Awards in February 1993, Tears in Heaven swept the night, winning Song of the Year, Record of the Year, and Best Male Pop Vocal Performance, while the Unplugged album won Album of the Year. Eric stood on the Grammy stage in a black tuxedo holding the golden gramophones. Millions of people watched around the globe. But in his acceptance speech, Eric didn't brag or celebrate. He simply thanked the audience and dedicated the honor to his son Connor, saying that music had saved his life during his darkest hours. Hold that thought, because what happened 12 years later is the most profound part of this entire story. For over a decade, Eric Clapton performed Tears in Heaven at every single concert he played. Fans would light matches and lighters in arenas across Europe, America, and Asia, singing along to every word. It became an anthem of comfort for millions of people who had lost children, parents, spouses, and friends. And then in 2004, Eric abruptly stopped playing it. He removed Tears in Heaven and My Father's Eyes from his concert setlists entirely. When journalists asked him why he was dropping his most famous, most beloved song, Eric gave an answer that shocked music critics, but made total sense to anyone who understood the human heart. Eric said, "I don't feel the loss anymore, which is a necessary part of playing those songs. I really have to connect with the feelings that were there when I wrote them. They're kind of gone, and I really don't want them to come back particularly. My life is different now. They probably need a rest, and I should perhaps introduce them from a much more detached point of view." Listen to what Eric was telling us. He had not written Tears in Heaven to be a lifelong commercial commodity. He had written it as a healing mechanism, a ladder to climb out of a pit of grief. And 12 years later, he had finally reached the top of that pit. He had found peace. Peace. He had accepted the loss of his son. And to stand on a stage every night and pretend to be in agony, just to entertain an audience, felt dishonest to the memory of Connor. The song had done its job. It had saved his life. It had healed his heart. And now it was time to let it rest. Though Eric eventually brought the song back for select acoustic shows years later, in a mature, peaceful arrangement, the legacy of Tears in Heaven remains one of the most powerful testimonies in modern music. As we look back on this timeless masterpiece, 3 core lessons emerge. First, great art requires radical honesty. Eric didn't try to hide behind metaphors or clever rock poses. He laid his heartbreak completely bare, asking the most innocent human question anyone can ask when facing death. Would you know my name? Second, restraint is often more powerful than noise. In an era dominated by loud electric guitars and stadium spectacle, a quiet nylon string acoustic guitar and a whispered vocal captured the attention of 26 million people. Silence and space can carry more emotion than a wall of amplifiers. And third, grief is not a permanent prison. Tears in Heaven shows us that we can walk through the valley of the shadow of death, process our pain through creative expression, and eventually emerge on the other side into light and peace. Where were you the first time Tears in Heaven reached your heart? Did you hear it on the radio in '92 or watch the unplugged performance late at night? Share your memory in the comments below. In the small churchyard of St. Mary Magdalene in Ripley, England, a small gravestone sits under the green trees. It reads, Connor Clapton, thousands of miles away on radios and record players across the world. A father's fingers are still picking those soft acoustic chords. Time moves on. The rain stops, and love endures beyond the veil.
The tragic loss behind the melody.